Aquarius. There are days when everything seems to move just as it always has. The rhythm of life doesn't change much. The same familiar stories repeat in familiar ways. And yet, somewhere inside you, something very subtle is shifting. It's not easy to name. And maybe it doesn't need to be understood right away. It's just that you're starting to notice you don't react the way you used to. The things that once felt heavy now seem to sit a little further away. Not because they've disappeared, but because you have changed in a very quiet, almost unnoticeable way. You still feel, you still think, you still carry pieces of the past with you, but this time, they don't pull you under. And maybe, what's changing isn't the world around you, but the way you're learning to stay with yourself. A little lighter, a little slower, and perhaps a little more real. And if you've been sensing this kind of quiet shift within you, then what comes next might meet you in a way that feels surprisingly personal. Aquarius. Maybe you don't have a name for this yet, and maybe you don't need to understand it all right now. It's just that in very ordinary moments, when you're sitting alone or when a day passes without anything remarkable, you suddenly notice something inside you has softened. The thoughts are still there. Old memories still visit from time to time. The feelings still reach you in familiar ways. But this time, they no longer take up all the space within you. It's like a lake after a long stretch of wind. Not perfectly still, but no longer restless either. You're still you. Someone who has always thought deeply, felt things fully. He carried things that not everyone could see. And yet, something has shifted in the way you stay with all of it. You're no longer rushing to find answers for everything, no longer feeling the need to immediately understand why something happened. You're beginning to allow yourself to simply feel. A feeling comes. You notice it. A thought appears. You see it. And then you let it pass. Not because you don't care anymore, but because you no longer need to hold on to everything. And maybe this is a very quiet kind of growth. No one announces that you've stepped into a new phase. There are no clear signs to confirm it. It's just that you no longer react the way you used to. The things that once weighed on you now leave only a soft echo. The questions that once kept you up no longer demand immediate answers. Yes, you're getting used to not knowing everything and still being okay. And in its own quiet way, that brings a kind of freedom. Nothing dramatic, nothing overwhelming. Just a small space to breathe that you didn't realize you had been missing. You may still be moving through unclear days, still standing in the middle of things that don't have names yet. But you no longer feel like you're being pulled away by them. You're still here, in your own life, with a different kind of presence, a little slower, a little lighter, and maybe a little more real. And then, in a very ordinary moment, you realize you're not in the same place anymore. Not because everything around you has changed, but because the way you feel this world is no longer the same. And maybe whatever is beginning within you right now doesn't need to be named too quickly. You just stay with it, the way you've been doing, gently, but enough to shift an entire journey. And maybe it's because you've lived through days like those that this sense of softening now feels as meaningful as it does. Aquarius. There were times when everything inside you no longer held its familiar shape. It wasn't one clear collapse, not a moment anyone else could easily point to. It was more like, little by little, you felt yourself coming apart on the inside. You still showed up on time, still replied to messages, still smiled when you needed to. From the outside, everything seemed fine, but only you knew. Some nights felt longer than they should. Silence didn't feel peaceful anymore. Thoughts kept circling, with no real place to land. You sat there, feeling like you were falling, with nothing to hold on to. And the hardest part wasn't even the sadness. It was the feeling of not knowing when it would end. You once asked yourself, very honestly, is this something I'll have to carry forever? A question that didn't need an answer. Just existing was enough to make everything feel heavier. And then, somehow you learned to keep going, not because you were certain things would be okay, but because there wasn't really another option. So you continued. You began gathering yourself again. Not just once, but over and over, piece by piece, emotion by emotion, thoughts that never quite finished forming. You quietly picked them up, placed them somewhere, even when you weren't sure where the right place was. No one taught you how to do that. There was no map, just you staying with yourself, even when it didn't feel good, even when everything inside you felt like it was working against you. And maybe back then you thought you were becoming weaker, that you weren't strong enough to hold it all together. But looking back now, maybe the story isn't quite that. Because showing up every day, while everything inside still felt messy, that's a very real kind of strength. Not giving up completely, even when you didn't know where you were headed. That's a kind of courage. You weren't becoming weaker. You were learning something difficult. How to endure without losing yourself, not numbing your feelings, not pretending everything was fine, but still feeling, still moving through it without disappearing inside it. And that, even if no one saw it, even if no one named it, was a very real step forward. There are journeys that make no sound. No one stands beside you to applaud, no clear moment of arrival, and yet they happen. Inside a person, quietly, steadily, with deep meaning. And if you've walked through days like that, then maybe the lightness you're feeling now isn't accidental. Maybe it's the result of every moment you chose not to abandon yourself. And if you look back, very slowly, you might begin to notice this sense of lightness you're feeling now didn't just appear by chance. It didn't come from a better day. And it's not because everything around you suddenly became easier. It's more like it was shaped by many small moments you may not even remember anymore. The times you almost reacted right away, but chose to pause, just for a second. Not because you stopped caring, but because you started to see that not everything needs an immediate response. You gave your emotions time to settle. You gave your thoughts space to rearrange themselves. And within that brief pause, something shifted, subtle, but enough to make a difference. You also began to realize not everyone needs to understand you. Not every story needs to be explained all the way through. There were times you tried to make others see your perspective. You wanted to clear every misunderstanding. You hoped that if you spoke with enough sincerity, things would somehow become easier. But over time, you started to understand. Real understanding doesn't come from explaining more. It comes from someone genuinely wanting to listen. And when that presence is no longer there, you begin to choose where your energy goes, not by closing yourself off, but by no longer pouring yourself into spaces that don't truly have room for you. And somewhere along the way, you started letting go of certain expectations, the ones that once exhausted you, the ideas of how things were supposed to be, the hopes you once held on to, believing that if you held on long enough, they would eventually become real. You didn't give up on hope. You just began learning where to place it, and that feels a lot like setting down a heavy bag you've been carrying for far too long. No loud moment, no dramatic turning point, just you breathing a little easier. You didn't change overnight. There's no clear line between before and after. It's just that day by day, through very small choices, you're becoming someone who feels less at war with yourself. You're learning not to force yourself to understand everything. Not to demand that you feel okay right away. Not to hold yourself to a version of strength that was never meant for you. And in that permission, you begin to feel safer being with yourself. The peace you're touching now isn't perfect. It still moves. There are still days that feel unclear. But it's real. Because it wasn't built on avoidance. It came from walking through enough to understand you don't have to fight everything just to feel okay. And maybe that's why this lightness doesn't feel fragile. It's there quietly, but steady enough for you to realize you're slowly stepping into a different way of living. A little slower, a little more real, and closer to yourself than you've ever been. And then, as you begin to slow down in your own quiet way, something else starts to come into view. Not all at once, not as a clear realization, but more like when you sit still long enough, now you begin to hear things you once overlooked. Aquarius. there's something you're starting to understand very gently, but deeply. Not every feeling needs to be fixed. Not every discomfort needs to disappear right away. There was a time you believed you had to understand everything. Find the reason, break it down, name every emotion so you could stay in control, as if understanding enough would keep you from being affected. But life doesn't always move that way. Some feelings aren't here to be explained. They're here to be felt. A passing sadness, a quiet sense of disappointment you can't quite trace, that empty feeling at the end of a long day. You don't rush to push them away anymore. You sit with them not to hold on, but to stop resisting. And when you stop resisting, they don't feel as heavy. Like a cloud moving across the sky, it doesn't need anything from you. As long as you don't try to hold it, it will pass, on its own. And in some ways, this applies to certain relationships in your life too. Not every connection needs a final explanation. Not every story needs a perfect ending. There were times you wanted to understand why someone left, why things didn't unfold the way you thought they would, why something that once felt clear became uncertain. Those questions may still be there, but they no longer control you. You begin to accept some things don't have immediate answers, and that doesn't make your experience any less meaningful. If anything, it opens you up in a different way. You're no longer trying to fix everything. You don't see every pause as a problem anymore. You don't assume every silence needs to be filled. And within those open spaces, you begin to feel something unfamiliar, a kind of freedom you hadn't noticed before. Not freedom from feeling, but freedom from needing to control what you feel. You still experience everything, but you're no longer pulled under by it. You still care, but you don't lose yourself in the process. You still keep your heart open, but you no longer feel the need to prove it to anyone. And what's interesting is when you stop trying to fix everything, so many things begin to feel lighter on their own. Not because they've changed, but because the way you are within them has. You no longer see everything as a problem to solve. You begin to see things as experiences moving through you. And maybe this is where you start to realize peace isn't about everything being perfect. It's about no longer feeling like everything has to be. It's a strange feeling, a new one, light, in a way that doesn't require effort, deep, in a way that doesn't need explanation. And if this is where you are now, then maybe you've come further than you think. It's just that this time, you don't need to prove it to anyone, and as you've moved through those quiet spaces, another shift begins to come into focus. Not in the way you see other people, but in the way you hold on to yourself when you're standing in front of them. Aquarius, your heart was never shallow. You feel deeply. You notice the small things. You remember details others may have forgotten long ago. You've given a lot your time, your care, your presence, not to get something back, but because that's how you connect to the world. And maybe because of that, there were times you went a little too far. You placed other people's emotions before your own. You tried to understand them, even when you were already tired. You stayed longer than you needed to, trusted more than felt safe, hoped just a little more. And somewhere along the way, you realized you were slowly drifting away from yourself while trying to hold on to something else, not just once, but more than once. Moments where afterward you found yourself asking, why did I give so much? But this time, something is different. You can still feel. You can still notice your heart slowing down when someone comes to mind. You can still remember a look, a sentence, a moment that didn't fully make sense, but stayed with you longer than expected. And yet, in this time, you don't let those feelings carry you too far away from yourself. You're no longer chasing a connection just because it once mattered. You're no longer holding on just because you once believed in it. You begin to ask a different question very quietly. Does this still fit who I am now? Not to judge, not to shut anything down, just to understand where you stand. And in that clarity, you begin to keep a part of yourself, a space you no longer give away completely, a boundary that doesn't need too much explanation, not to create distance, but to keep balance. You still open your heart, but not to the point where you lose your way back. You still care, but you no longer place your entire center in someone else's hands. You can still love deeply, sincerely, but without trading away who you are just to hold on to that feeling. And this at first might feel unfamiliar. You might have wondered, am I changing too much? Am I becoming distant? Or colder? But if you listen a little more closely, you'll begin to see this isn't distance. This is steadiness, a very different kind of presence. You no longer need to prove your feelings by giving too much of yourself. You no longer need to stay just to keep something from falling apart. You choose to stay when it also nourishes you. And you choose to leave when you feel yourself slowly disappearing. No noise, no drama, just an inner shift, clear enough for you to feel. And maybe, for the first time, you're holding onto your heart without losing yourself. Something that once felt fragile now begins to feel a little more real. And you don't have to do much to keep it that way. Just continue staying with yourself. And even when the feelings are still there, that is enough. And then, at some very ordinary moment, without warning, without any clear sign, you suddenly realize you're still here. After all the times you felt unsteady, after the days you didn't know where to begin again, after the moments you thought you wouldn't be able to hold yourself together anymore, and yet, you're still here. Not as a more perfect version of yourself, not as someone who has everything figured out, but as a quieter version of you, a kind of calm that's hard to explain. Not because everything around you has fallen into place, but because something inside you is no longer fighting against itself. You're not strong in a loud, visible way. You don't need to prove that you've made it through. It's just that there's a steadiness now. Like a tree that doesn't need to grow taller right away, but its roots have gone deeper. You may still have difficult days. You may still feel tired. Old emotions can still surface when something brings them back. But this time, you're not afraid in the same way. Not because you're certain everything will be okay, but because you know no matter what happens, you won't abandon yourself. And that changes more than you might expect. You no longer see challenges as signs of falling apart. You begin to see them as natural parts of the journey. They come, they go, just like everything else always has. There may still be days when you feel lost, days when everything feels unclear again. But deep within, there's an anchor you've found, a place you can return to without needing to search anywhere else. It's you. Not perfect, not always certain, but real enough. And maybe the biggest shift isn't in your circumstances, but in the fact that you're no longer afraid of falling apart. Because you've been there before. You've lived through it. You've gathered yourself back together when no one else was there. So this time, if the waves return, you know you can stand a little steadier. Not because you no longer feel pain, but because you no longer leave yourself when the pain shows up. And sometimes, happiness isn't something grand. It's not when everything becomes clear. It's not when every question finally has an answer. It's when you can sit with yourself on a very ordinary day and quietly feel, this is enough. Enough to keep going. Enough to breathe a little easier. Enough to not feel the need to run somewhere else to become someone different. Because you're already here. Yeah, and slowly, you're becoming a safe place for yourself. And maybe that is one of the most real forms of peace you've ever touched. And if you've stayed with this until now, maybe you're moving through a phase of your own that's just as personal. You don't have to name it yet. You don't have to understand everything. Just stay with yourself a little longer. Listen a little more closely. Be a little gentler with who you are. And if something in this journey resonates with you in your own way, you can keep it. And what doesn't, you can let it pass. Because in the end, this was never about becoming someone else. It's about returning and staying with who you truly are, slowly, but honestly.